March 3, 2023, Dallas, Texas. The house was dark. Too dark. James Carter stood at the front door, his overnight bag slung over his shoulder. Something wasn't right. He hadn't heard from his wife or son in days. Calls went unanswered. Messages ignored. He pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, carrying a strange, sharp chill. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. "Lisa," he called. Silence. His heart pounded as he moved through the quiet home. Michael's room was empty. No sign of his son, no sign of his wife. Then he noticed something. A faint odor. Cold but wrong. His eyes landed on the kitchen. The freezer door was slightly ajar. James stepped forward. He reached out. He pulled the door open. And that's when he saw him. Before we dive deeper into this tragic case, make sure to subscribe and like Just Dark Crimes for more gripping true crime stories. And now let's continue. What began as irritation soon evolved into cruelty. At first, it was small things, short bursts of anger when Michael struggled to communicate, impatient tugs when he didn't follow her instructions fast enough. But those moments grew in frequency and intensity. Lisa's patience, once portrayed as endless, was running thin. As days turned into weeks, her actions became darker. A slap here, a shove there. She would lock him in his room when he was particularly disruptive, telling him to calm down until his tantrums subsided. It was as if she was trying to control him, bending him to fit into the ideal she had created in her mind, a child who was normal and didn't require so much effort, so much understanding. James, often away for work, was oblivious to the slow erosion of his son's well-being. Lisa's well-practiced facade held up well in his absence. She smiled when he returned home, spoke of Michael's progress, and reassured him that everything was under control. But when James wasn't around, Michael became a burden, a constant reminder of what Lisa couldn't tolerate. It was one evening, after a particularly difficult week, that things escalated. Lisa had been dealing with an overwhelming amount of stress. Michael, as always, had his moments of emotional overload, and this time, the sounds of his crying and shouting seemed to send her over the edge. In a fit of rage, she locked him in the wardrobe, something she'd done a few times in the past as a punishment for his outbursts. But this time she left him in there longer than usual. Michael cried, but no one came to help. By the time Lisa finally let him out, his behavior was even more erratic than before. She didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to make him stop. Frustrated, she decided the next step was to lock him away for longer. This time, however, she chose the freezer. It was a calculated decision, a way to keep him still, quiet, and out of sight even if only for a while. She told herself it was temporary, just until he'd calmed down. But as the minutes ticked by and then the hours, Lisa's guilt started to creep in. When James came home early one evening, his flight canceled due to bad weather, he walked into the house and immediately felt something was wrong. He called out for Michael, but no answer came. A deep, uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. He searched the house, growing more frantic by the second. Finally, in the garage, he found the freezer, its door slightly ajar. Inside, Michael lay unmoving, his body cold to the touch. His son, his only child, was barely alive. James immediately tried to revive him, but it was too late. Michael had been left in the freezer for hours, long enough that the damage was irreversible. It wasn't until after the ambulance had arrived and the authorities began their investigation that the truth slowly started to surface. Lisa Holloway, the woman James had trusted with his son, had been hiding the dark side of her behavior, an unchecked rage that had led to her cruel actions. And the neighbor who had once suspected something was wrong finally spoke up, but it was too little, too late. As the investigation unraveled, it became clear that Lisa's history of abusive behavior was not an isolated incident. She had been hiding her past from James, carefully crafting a new life that seemed picture-perfect. But now, with Michael gone, the truth had been exposed, and it was a truth James could never erase. James had been away for a week on a business trip, unaware of the escalating violence in his home. He was looking forward to returning, to seeing Michael again, and finally being with his family after the long days of travel. He had no idea that his son was trapped, suffering in a place that should have been his sanctuary. As James pulled into the driveway that evening, something felt off. There was a stillness to the house, a kind of quiet that made his skin prickle. He opened the front door, calling out for Michael, expecting his son to come running to greet him with his usual excitement. But there was no response. Silence. He checked the kitchen, then the living room, then the backyard. Nothing. His concern deepened with each empty room he searched. He called out again, his voice tinged with unease. Then as he passed the kitchen he noticed the freezer. It was slightly ajar, an unsettling sight in the quiet home. His heart raced as he approached it, almost knowing, praying it wasn't what he feared. But when he opened the lid, the horrific reality hit him like a tidal wave. Inside, Michael lay lifeless, his body cold and stiff, his eyes barely open. The freezer was an unnatural, suffocating chill, and yet, it couldn't compare to the suffocating weight of what had happened. James immediately rushed to his son, his hands trembling as he checked for any sign of life. There was nothing. Michael was gone. The tears came first, raw and uncontrollable. Then came the questions. What? Oh. How could Lisa have done this? His mind raced, struggling to make sense of the unimaginable. He had trusted her. He had trusted the woman he had married to care for his son as he would. But now that trust had been shattered beyond repair. Meanwhile, Eleanor Baker, the elderly neighbor, sat in her small living room, staring out the window at the Carter house. She had seen James return, seen the flashing lights of the police cars, and heard the sirens that pierced the calm of the neighborhood. She had known something was wrong, but she never stepped forward, never acted on the nagging feeling that had gnawed at her for months. Now, as the events unfolded before her eyes, she could only sit in silence, consumed by the guilt that had been eating at her for so long. Eleanor had seen the bruises on Michael's arms, had heard his quiet sobs through the thin walls at night, but each time she had dismissed it. She had heard Lisa's angry shouts and seen the way Michael flinched whenever she raised her voice. But it was always just a little too easy to convince herself that maybe she was overthinking it. That maybe, in some twisted way, it was normal. Normal for a child to be punished, normal for a stepmother to struggle. But now, as she watched the police work the scene, she knew she couldn't hide from the truth any longer. The truth that Lisa Holloway, the woman who had once seemed like the answer to all of James's prayers, had been nothing more than a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. And now, with Michael dead, there would be no turning back for either of them. As the police gathered evidence, James was escorted into the living room, his face pale and stricken with disbelief. His mind was numb, still processing the horror that had unfolded in his home. His wife, the woman he had trusted with his son, had turned into a monster. The woman he had believed in was the very one who had condemned Michael to die in the darkness of a cold freezer. But the deeper tragedy was the way it had all unfolded in front of neighbors who had turned a blind eye. Eleanor's silence had been a contributing factor to the nightmare that had claimed Michael's life. She could have called the authorities, could have intervened when she saw the signs of abuse. But instead she had chosen to look away. Now all that was left were broken lives. James had lost his son, and Eleanor would have to live with the knowledge that, in the end, her failure to act had cost a child his life. The truth of what had happened in that house would echo through the community, leaving a stain that would never be washed away. And Lisa would soon be held accountable for her actions, but no punishment could ever bring Michael back. No justice could undo the tragedy that had taken root in a home that should have been a safe place. James Carter's heart raced as he entered his home on the evening of March 3, 2023. He had been trying, unsuccessfully, to reach Lisa and Michael for over a week, his calls to both going unanswered. It wasn't like them to shut him out. He hadn't expected to return early from his flight, but something inside him pushed him to do so. The house was eerily quiet. Lisa? Michael? His voice echoed down the hallway as he moved through the dimly lit house. There were no sounds of the television or the usual soft music playing from the living room. No sign of life. A sense of dread curled in his gut. He checked Michael's room first, but it was empty. His heart sank as he continued his search, the growing feeling of unease gripping him harder with every step. The kitchen was cold, the lights off, and as he moved closer, something else hit him, a strange, pungent smell that made him hesitate. His brow furrowed in confusion. He turned toward the freezer, his breath catching in his throat. The smell grew stronger the closer he got, a faint mix of something sour and metallic. James reached out for the freezer door. His hands shook as he pulled the lid open, expecting nothing more than some forgotten leftovers. What he found made his blood run cold. There, wrapped tightly in a blanket, lay his son, his 15-year-old boy Michael, barely clinging to life. His skin was pale, bruised, and cold to the touch. The horror in James's chest was suffocating. He could barely breathe, let alone think. How could this happen in his home to his son? Michael, he cried, shaking his son desperately. The boy's body was stiff, unresponsive, but there was a faint pulse, a fragile thread of life that made James cling to hope. He pulled Michael out of the freezer, his own heart breaking as he laid him on the floor. Frantic, James grabbed his phone, calling 911 with trembling hands. My son's been in the freezer, he's not okay. Please help. His voice cracked, panic rising in his chest. The dispatcher responded, guiding him through CPR, but James couldn't stop the gnawing thought in his mind. Where was Lisa? As the paramedics arrived and rushed Michael to the hospital, James's mind reeled. He couldn't understand. Michael had been with Lisa for days, with no signs of trouble when he left. How had it gone so wrong? The pieces didn't fit, and yet here he was holding on to the fragile hope that it wasn't too late. But it was too late. The doctors worked tirelessly to save Michael, but despite their efforts, the young boy didn't make it. The trauma of the cold, the lack of oxygen, it was too much for his body to withstand. Michael Carter, the son James had raised alone for years, was dead. In the wake of the tragedy, Lisa had vanished. James called her phone again and again, but it went straight to voicemail. Her belongings were gone, and the house, now more empty than ever, seemed to reflect the chaos inside his mind. There were no signs of a struggle, no explanation for her disappearance. She had simply vanished as if she had never been there at all. Desperate for answers, James began his own search. He combed through the house, trying to make sense of what had happened in his absence. His mind lingered on the last time he had spoken to Lisa, the last time he had seen her. She had been distant, yes, but had he missed the signs? The authorities quickly got involved, but the investigation turned up troubling revelations. Lisa's past, one she had kept hidden from James, began to surface. She had been involved in previous abuse allegations in Phoenix, Arizona, incidents that had been brushed aside, dismissed for lack of evidence. A pattern of manipulation, deceit, and violence that had gone unnoticed until now. But it was too late for Michael. The investigation into Lisa's disappearance grew more perplexing with each passing day. Authorities combed through every possible lead, from searching abandoned buildings to tracing her last known movements, but it seemed as if Lisa had vanished without a trace. Her phone records were blank. No calls, no texts, just dead air. Her bank account was equally empty, with no withdrawals or transactions that could provide a clue. Every search turned up nothing, and despite the urgency with which the authorities pursued her, it felt like she had dissolved into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the lingering echoes of her crimes. As the investigation dragged on, the community that had once looked the other way began to stir with regret. Eleanor Baker, who had heard Michael's cries for help, now found herself haunted by the knowledge that she had done nothing. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of her failure to act when it mattered most. She had convinced herself that it was none of her business, or that it was just a phase the family was going through. But now, with the truth laid bare, Eleanor saw how wrong she had been, and the weight of that realization crushed her. She wasn't the only one feeling the sting of inaction. Neighbors who had once dismissed the signs of abuse, or turned a blind eye, now found themselves grappling with their own guilt. It was too late to undo their silence, too late to make amends. The community that had once been blind to the suffering happening just behind their fences was now consumed with regret, bound together by the shared knowledge that they had failed Michael most crucially. For James Carter, the questions piled up with no answers in sight. Every night was a battle with his own mind, racing through theories and possibilities that all ended in dead ends. He couldn't shake the image of Lisa's face, the woman he had married and trusted, and the thought that she might be somewhere out there, free, while his son lay buried in the cold silence of their home. Had she fled the country, perhaps with a fake identity? Or had something far more sinister taken place? Had someone decided that Lisa's twisted version of motherhood needed to end permanently? James couldn't help but wonder if someone, maybe a stranger, had taken matters into their own hands, seeking justice for Michael in a way the legal system could never provide. The uncertainty gnawed at him. What if, in trying to find answers, he only dug himself deeper into a mystery with no resolution? The authorities pursued their theories, speaking with friends, relatives, and anyone who might have information on Lisa's whereabouts. They even suggested the possibility that Lisa had staged her disappearance, that she was hiding somewhere, waiting for the dust to settle. But the longer she stayed gone, the more unlikely it seemed that she would ever return to face the consequences of her actions. And yet, James couldn't escape the feeling that he was at fault. He lost his wife and now his son. Why didn't he acknowledge the signs? He brought Lisa into his son's life. As the investigation began to slow, the questions seemed to multiply. Was Lisa hiding, biding her time before revealing her version of events? Would she manipulate the narrative, painting herself as the victim, the one who had been left to deal with Michael alone, without help or understanding from James? The thought of her turning the tables on him, blaming him for his absence, made James sick to his stomach. Would she rewrite the story in such a way that it painted her as the martyr, The woman who had been left to care for a troubled child while her husband was off on business trips? It seemed like the ultimate manipulation, but could she really twist the truth to make herself appear innocent? The uncertainty loomed large in James's mind. If Lisa were ever found, would she come clean about her actions? Would she admit the horrifying truth about how she had treated Michael, or would she try to manipulate the investigation, hoping to escape the full consequences of her cruelty? Could the community ever truly understand what had happened behind closed doors, or would they forever be left to wonder? As the weeks passed, the investigation into Lisa's whereabouts seemed to stall. The leads grew colder, the search less urgent. The authorities continued their efforts, but without concrete evidence, there was only so much they could do. The pain of losing Michael would never leave James, no matter what the investigation uncovered. The questions, however, were a different kind of torment, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. The answers, if they came, would not bring back Michael, but they might offer a chilling glimpse into the darkness that had been festering in the house all along. If you're intrigued by this twisted case, or if you have questions about the truth behind the shadows, make sure to subscribe to Just Dark Crimes for more chilling stories like this one. We dive into the heart of dark mysteries, uncovering the truth, no matter how unsettling it may be. Stay tuned.